I'm Srujani, and I am the moderator for this session on rising seas, rising tension. And I would like to invite our panelists. So we have two of them in person. Louise, who is the Global Director for Social Sustainability and Inclusion at the World Bank, and Jevanic, who is a fellow at Alliance of Small Island States. Please welcome them with a round of applause. Yeah, thank you. And joining us online are Amina, Bintaleb. Can we have Amina, Bintaleb on the screen? Binta, Bajaha, and Opira. Amazing, thank you. So this plenary session will address the intersectional challenges of climate change and areas affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. As we've already heard, that climate change can exacerbate FCV situations by leading to droughts, flood, and food insecurity. And the World Bank predicts that climate change could force 216 million people across 6 world regions to move within their countries by 2050. It's really an honor to be moderating this panel, and I don't want to take much time. And I think let's just kickstart with the first question, where I would invite all the speakers to help us understand the complex relationship between fragility and climate change. How do climate shocks create or exacerbate fragility? So may I first invite Louise, followed by Jevanic, then Amina, Binta, and Opira. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And first of all, let me just say what an honor it is to be here with you and to have a discussion on climate action, because it is really, unfortunately, you who are going to have to take this agenda forward. And there's so much to be done. And we're starting to work on it. It's starting to move, but it's really going to land squarely in your lap and the lap of my grandchildren. So the question is, what is the link between climate and conflict? And I'd like to highlight 4 specific areas. First, conflict is always associated with exclusion. One group is got less, one group is out. Conflict also reduces, as we've seen, and we're hearing stories come out of Sudan, and we're hearing stories from Ukraine, but and also wherever else we want to look of hotspots, of less access to service. So you're looking at people who are excluded, you're looking at people who don't have access to health services, you're looking at people who don't have access to labor incomes, people who don't often have access to financial markets because the markets have crumbled in the face of conflict. So it's a challenge of exclusion, and that the relationship between when climate shocks hit, you already don't have access to the health services you may need, to the financial markets you may need to help you deal with the drought, to the labor markets to deliver income or to sell your goods. So that's the first challenge, is that exclusion from conflict makes you more vulnerable to shocks because you have less access to tools to deal with it. The second is resilience. Countries in conflict already have are more vulnerable to begin with. They're facing, as you heard, challenges of interpersonal violence, challenges of gender-based violence, challenges of child labor, more often child soldiers. And so they're already less equipped. The infrastructure has been destroyed, that they need the roads, that they need the transportation infrastructure. So there's a link between conflict and the ability to be resilient and to be safe that's aggravated by climate shocks. Third is social cohesion. When you have conflict, you don't have social cohesion. You have lack of trust, often within a community, between different groups, between communities, between ethnic groups, between pastoralists and farmers, and between communities and the state. Without trust, it's very difficult to come together to deal with a water shortage, to deal with flooding, to deal with any of the climate shocks, because you're not able to act collectively. In a situation of no trust, everybody acts individually, and what we need in the face of climate action is collective behavior. And finally, is something called process legitimacy, which is how decisions are taken. and who's involved in those decisions. When you have conflict, there's often not a clear process for deciding who accesses which resource, who's able to make a decision that everyone's going to follow to adhere to. And so we see situations where decisions are made in conflict areas at a very local level by one particular group, for instance, in northern Cameroon, where fisher folk built bigger ponds, man-made ponds, to protect their fishing resources, which led to catastrophic results for pastoral communities who then lacked access, were not able to do their migration that they needed to do with the cattle to reach the greener grasses. So decisions are made in ad hoc ways, often in a conflict situation, and that makes it very difficult to plan. That makes it very difficult to have transparent and accountable decisions, which is what you need to be able to address climate action. So let me just stop by saying the 4 things I listed: inclusion, cohesion, process legitimacy, and resilience are all dimensions of social sustainability. Social sustainability is eroded when you have conflict, and it is further eroded in the cases of and makes it then very difficult to address climate action, which requires social sustainability, collective action, transparent and planned decision-making, inclusive access to services. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Louise. Over to you, Jevanic.
Yeah, thanks. Just in answering your question, just to get a feel of the room, by a raise of hand, who here is from a developing country? All right. What about from a developed country? Okay, and of course, from my small island developing states, any here? Or also, I know there are watch parties online. Anybody from a small island developing state? Okay, I see at the back. And the final question then. Who here believes that your country is on the front line of climate change? So I think essentially we see that, based on the response, that we sort of have a collective responsibility. And of course, I'm not going to dwell into all of the climate shocks. I think now we know the science is clear. It is clear for everyone to see. And just touching on how this has exacerbated the fragility, looking at it particularly from the angle of small states where, we have existing high debt levels, we have very small and open economies, and of course, when the external shocks happen, that triggers these sort of economic implications, which threaten our ability to invest in these socioeconomic areas, whether it is health, education. And I think we all would understand the implications of being unable to effectively invest in these critical issues and critical areas, and the sort of ripple effects which it creates in the society. And the question now is, and again, I'm going to be very sort of solution oriented, because we all hear about the issues, we all hear about the shocks. We know that, typical example, in terms of resources, during the COVID-19 pandemic, what is the one thing which people sort of rush to get to in the supermarket? I think it went sort of viral or whatnot. What is it? Toilet paper, right? So look at it, within the COVID-19 pandemic, this one resource, for whatever reason, was seen to be scarce. And everybody just ran, and you could see the potential conflict, even in the supermarkets, people fighting and whatnot. So look at it even in the climate change context, where now we've seen that with unsustainable use of our natural resources, various resources become very, it's infinite, and then the potential for creating conflict. So yes, we are in a world right now that we have, existing conflicts and so on, but just imagine with the threats as our resources deteriorate due to the climate crisis, what are the potential conflicts? But again, in terms of solution, how can we address that? And I always say that the power lies in us as young people. I consider myself to be very young as well. I was also a delegate a couple of years ago. But also it's a point of having that community-driven approach. Even in your existing initiatives, I want to urge that we continue to adopt approaches where we build coalitions and not just operate in silos, because that is how we'll be able to counteract these climate shocks and to counteract these socio-economic issues due to our fragile economies and so on. So I just want to urge particularly to just continue to build coalitions, because I often see within various countries that we operate, we do certain things, but then it's not the ability to upskill individually. It's not always possible. Look at it even your sub-regional approach, because of course, If you're in Africa, you cannot perhaps deliver a regional project, but look at it even in the sub-regional areas. In the Caribbean, within the Eastern Caribbean, in the Pacific, what are the areas we can sort of tap into? And that is why I want to encourage us, of course, as young people, that we capitalize on these spaces, because that is where you can share the ideas. And I can tell you from my personal experience that the conversations out there, these are where the solutions are really developed and driven, that will allow us to counteract all of the climate shocks and, of course, the other socio-economic challenges, which sadly it exacerbates.
Thank you. Over to you, Amina.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be with you today, and sorry not to be in person with you. Regarding to the issue, unfortunately, the climate change doesn't differentiate between any country in this planet. Like, it's affecting the poor countries and the rich countries. But the thing is that the most affected countries are the least developing countries. Like, for example, in Yemen. And at the same time, these countries are the least polluted countries. So we get affected by the climate change, and we can't do much about it, because in a country that suffer from like conflict and war and poorness, feminine, all these things, it's hard to talk about things related to climate change or the environment. So this is the idea when the innovated projects come and the civil societies work in. For example, I am a social entrepreneur, and of what I saw in my countries, especially from the heritage buildings that was very affected by the climate change, and we lost some of them. I tried to make some solutions, and but it's not enough for us because of the climate change crisis.
Thank you, Amina. Over to you, Binta.
Hi, everybody. Same as Amina. Apologies for not being able to talk and attend in person. I'll just go straight into it. As colleagues have spoken about, consequences of climate change are manifested differently across geographies, life realities, and across bodies. So, of course, what impacts one person in an urban area will not be the same as someone who's impacting in rural areas. And the same goes as to so-called global north and global south. I will, however, because the question asked about the linkages between climate change and food insecurity, which is undeniable. However, the link of climate change and conflict is fuzzy at best. However, there's no denying competition on dwindling resources, which erode social cohesion and ramp up tension. So in acknowledging that some countries, like I'm from the Gambia, which is part of the Sahel, which is a geographical zone across the African continent, for example, is very, very prone to climate shocks. Now, what happens is in the intersection of it, we do see that food insecurity has tremendously increased a lot, and because all due that anthropogenic climate changes impact directly food producers. Most in the African continent, but mostly in the African continent, most of the Latin America and Asia, a lot of the producers are smallholder farmers. And these smallholder farmers do not have the capital to actually invest in irrigation systems or that will be able to help them prevent being super dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So for me, what it comes down to is the entrenchment of longstanding global inequalities that has rendered some bodies, be it Yemen, be it the Gambia, be it Pakistan, being somewhere in Latin America, more vulnerable to climate change than others. And the solutions that have to be created on that should actually take a look at the intersectional lens of it. Who is it that is impacted? Like my PhD research focused on the intersectional fragility of climate change and taking a look at the micro, meso, and macro. I feel like with climate change, we cannot just focus on local solutions because it's a global problem. We can't keep talking about local communities at the front lines of climate change without taking a look back as to how the meso and macro really affects the micro as well. So everything is interlinked, and we keep talking about holistic way of approaching it. But at the same time, I feel like that's the only way that we could deal with the consequences of food insecurity which is exacerbated all the time by conflict and then exacerbated even more by climate change. So be it in my line of work, I've traveled the past couple of years, I've traveled a lot to the forefront of the floodings in Pakistan, the heat waves and droughts across like the Horn of Africa and West Africa, for example. And you could see how if these compounding impacts keep occurring all the time, the same people that were resilient at one point go under and cannot cope anymore. So the question actually is, what can we do instead of adding more pressure to them and to asking them, what can you do to actually solve the problem, right? That's why I want us to take a step back and be it from the micro, we take a look at the macro as well, in parallel. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to you, Opira.
Yes, thank you so much for having me in the summit virtually, and apology for not attending physically. I think as a perfect example that I see physically here, the link between climate change and fragility, conflict, and violence. Looking at from my situation, the situation of my country, South Sudan, where the war happened and we fled the country and moved to another country. That's where we are in Uganda. You find that in the process of conflict, you find that there are a lot of destruction to environment, and in the process, displacement of other people, where a community who used to keep cattle comes and settle in a place of where people used to cultivate their crops. So after a period of time, you realize that the land for agriculture can no longer sustain the livelihood of people because they can't produce crops. So the main thing I see is, as it happens in the current situation of the settlement where we are staying in Bintaleb refugee settlement in northern Uganda, the changes that has happened in the last 5 years since we settled here, because of the conflict. Of course, this place was deserted. I mean not deserted. It was forested. A lot of trees. The soil was fertile. But when a lot of people were settled in a small plot of land, and because people hardly have any source of energy for cooking, the only source of cooking was firewood. And as a means of livelihood, people are forced to look for, to use natural resources like trees, burning charcoal to supplement their small food ratio that is distributed by the UN. So you find that after 2-3 years, the weather of this place drastically changed, and the place became dry. The crop does not grow well as it used to be in the first 2 years. So I clearly see that conflict leads to climate change. But also when climate change has already happened, for example, the place turned dry and the crops does not grow, the source of livelihood is disrupted, again, that increases more conflict. Because now here in the settlement where I stay, refugees have to, have tensions between host community, in search for land for other alternative sources of food. We all know globally right now, the war in different parts of the world has made it very impossible for UNHCR to support refugees in different parts of the world. And it has forced them to reduce the food ratio that they used to give to them. So refugees find that they have no option but to request or try to look for alternatives means of survival. Even in the other way, children are no longer going to school because if there is no food to eat and there is no money, there's no resources to support children, parents are forced to cut trees to burn charcoal. This is the only way they can survive. In fact, for only as a source of energy for cooking their food. So you find that the reality and the link between climate change and displacement, conflict and violence is actually very clear. I think there is no way we can be tracing it like a lot of technical, but the truth is conflict leads to climate change, but also climate change leads to more forms of conflict. So this is why myself, as a student who was supported by UNHCR to access education, together with my colleagues at the university, looking at the solutions that our community needs and the actual problems that they face and the insufficiency that the UNHCR have to serve the population of refugees. We realize that we need something to do. we need something to do to influence our community, to be able to create this change by themselves and then sustain this change by themselves. So this is why I founded an organization called the Leads, to be able to, teach the community that we are responsible for the change that we want, but also sometimes we are responsible for the destructions of our environment, the climate change that we are experiencing. So to me, my message is just like my colleague started in the beginning. There's already a very clear line between the very clear connection between displacement, livelihoods, and climate change. Local solutions need to be supported. This is the best way we can sustain all the approaches that we are preaching all over the world. It can best be sustained by the local community, because when you plant the trees, it is the local community who lives there, and they're able to sustain and keep these trees to grow. But they are also be able to support their own innovation to look for alternative means of, sustaining their livelihoods instead of experiencing the violence and taking it to the environment and destroying the environment further. So to me, I think this summit is very essential for the community who are attending the summit to look at directly the solutions, supporting the people affected by climate change and the people affected by displacement in responding to the climate change. No matter what happened, whether the climate change has not yet happened, there is a high probability that where conflict has happened and where violence is happening, there is high likelihood for climate change to happen. So we need to support climate change before it happens. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Opira. So with that note, I would like to reiterate, climate change leads to conflict and conflict leads to climate change, as Opira highlighted. And I really appreciate the solution-oriented approach that our panelists focused on. With that context, I think we can now deep dive into different topics. First, I think we can start with food insecurity. So for this, I would like to invite Amina Bintaleb, who is YOUNGA Youth Delegate 2021 for the UN General Assembly Trainer for YLDF Yemen. Binta Bajaha, who is a Special Assistant to Emergency Director at World Food Programme, and Opira, who is the founder of the Leads and Climate Change Activist. So the question to these panelists is, when thinking of solutions to address food security resulting from climate shocks, what is the best approach for implementation? In your opinion, could it be reforms, policies, investment in resilient infrastructure? And why do local communities need to be at the forefront of these solutions? So I would like to invite Amina, followed by Binta, followed by Opira. Over to you. Thank you.
So regarding to this, I believe it's a group work, not individually. So we all have to be together in these solutions. What I mean with together is the local authorities, the investors, the social entrepreneurs, and the civil societies, and even the farmers or the citizens who are working in farming and agriculture sector. For example, in Yemen, we implemented some technical solutions. For example, we start using the solar energy because of the increasing of the fuel costs, especially in the past 8 years. And we start using some techniques like, for example, the mulch and the irrigation systems. All these help to increase in the agriculture economy and help us to resist the climate change crisis.
I'll just jump straight into it. Is that okay, Srujani?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. So I do feel like if we're talking about food security and some of the solutions, of course, working for the World Food Programme we have the front view on the deterioration of food insecurity around the world. And the traditional way of getting donors within these UN systems or working with partners such as the World Bank to channel the money into governments is proven to not be enough. However, we do have problems like donor fatigue. So I do think that it's time to, in our conversation, change the way that we go about it. in which if we are serious about getting the local community to be part of it, we cannot be sitting in Geneva, Washington, Rome, and writing these projects and then sending it back to the so-called global South, and then expecting result in such a small scale. Everything will have to be scaled up in a meaningful way. Meaning, and going back to colleagues on the panel that were talking about in northern Uganda, I actually worked there for a couple of months in the South Sudanese refugee camps. It's such a complex matter that you cannot have local solutions that are so tiny that cannot actually translate to the borders of South Sudan, that can't translate to the borders of Kenya. So for the African continent, it has to be a regional approach in ways that we are from, like I'm from the Gambia, but my forefathers were from Guinea, my mother's born in Mali. So it cannot focus on nation states and borders that are artificial, because the problem goes beyond it. And I feel like, and talk about food security, sometimes the country has completely vast realities between the urban centers and the rural or the north and the south, depending on your geographical location. So in that way, I will, within my line of work, within the UN, I will encourage everybody to work with local governments, not bypassing the national government, but if you can work with local governments and understand how communities organize themselves. Each community has a traditional way of organizing themselves, and that's the best approach, to speak to them as to what their problems are, what the solutions are, and work with other type of knowledge that we have gathered globally and share. We have to be able to cross-share knowledge in ways that is actually innovative. And I think these type of platforms are very great. We should be able to talk to young entrepreneurs in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and also include the private sector. And not to blame people, but the capitalist system and the food systems that we currently have is unsustainable. So we can be making the solutions. Like we can have Opira working so hard, and yet the global system is just not conducive for change. So that's the approach that I'll be hoping that we'll be able to get somehow in this generation.
Thank you, Binta. Over to you, Opira.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I want to pick from what my sister Binta said. You see, today I've just been training our local leaders, refugee leaders, all the leaders in the settlement, and I was kind of asking them what exactly is the problem, why we can't find a permanent solution to our problem. Because right now there is back and forth movement. Although the war is reducing in our country in South Sudan, climate change is forcing people to come back, and climate change is making it very hard for people to return home, because the home has turned into desert. There's no way your crop can grow. There's no way, the other side, the flood is too much. So now the question is, how can our solution give us a security about our future? Now, also there's been a concern where you find big organizations, and I call them big organizations. They have a large funding. They are capable. They call them capable, and they implement projects. But when the project ends, you see what happened at the end of the project. How there appears to be like no pictures of the project has happened. They start looking for local solutions to sustain what they've been implementing. So I see the solution to our food security, so that the climate solutions remain a permanent solution and durable solution for us. Local solutions needs to be prioritized in the global systems of financing all, the reasons for financing the humanitarian service. Local solutions need to be prioritized to sustain all the approaches, because it's a cheaper and a more easier way, and it's actually part of life. For example, having a youth center or community center where community goes to access them, to remind themselves about the skills they have got to sustain, maybe to produce productive types of crops that support them to reduce poverty. That doesn't require an additional spending or additional expense, but it is a community-based a system that is maintained by the community. This is why, as the LEADS organization, we've been trying to work with the community regardless of the resources. Without the resources, we're trying to create impact. We're trying to solve multiple issues, but all linked to climate change. But all has started from advocating into coming to create solutions. So my suggestion to the donors, the local, international community, is to look into a way of linking displacement and climate change clearly, because we normally forget the displacement. We look at only the final destination where refugees are taking refuge. We forget where they came from. Because if we link this together and knowing that there will be back and forth movement where the people need to return home, there will be a system of supporting the initiatives that will support themselves to take the initiative in the settlement where they're staying to the home where they came from. So that is what I suggest for the international community. But also to us, the youth, I want to say something to the youth about taking action. We should not ignore our personal potential in giving support to our community in terms of taking direct action in a small scale, right from home, from a small block, because a small action can really count. I have seen how it has counted in the school when I started the project of planting trees in schools, where I knew it is the only place where different trees, a large sector of, a large plot of land, trees can be planted and it can be maintained. So in the homestead and in other community when the people are not sensitized, it's very, very hard to take actions within that approach. So I call upon the youth and all the communities around and all the participants in the summit to try as much as possible in their own means without waiting for a large interventions to try to take step and take some action within their community. With this, we can collectively make an end to the crisis of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you for calling the youth and the community contribution. Now let's move on to the in-person panelists. So I would like to request Louise and Jevanic. So this question is, based on your expert knowledge and experience, can you share what are some of the challenges that are unique to small island states when it comes to mitigating the effects of climate change? How can small island states be better protected from climate shocks in the future? Louise, followed by Jevanic. Over to you.
Thank you. First, let me say that where my direct experience comes from working in small states, I worked as practice manager for poverty in Latin America and did a lot of work in the Caribbean on poverty statistics and poverty programs. And then I was country director for the World Bank in West Africa, covering Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Mauritania, and Cabo Verde, and had a chance to work on some of these issues in Cabo Verde. But I would also venture to say that in many ways, Guinea-Bissau and Gambia are also small island states dealing with some of the huge challenges of climate change, if Binta doesn't mind me making that comparison. So, I think the challenges come from, just to step back, the climate shocks are both gradual and slow, and shocks from typhoons and rains and heavy flooding and droughts. And it's both sides that get the small island states as well as many other climate vulnerable areas. I would say the biggest challenges, and I think my colleague Jevanic alluded to them, one is the really poor quality of infrastructure. Small island states have very tight fiscal budgets, and I never saw, for the level of GDP per capita that many of them had because of tourism, the quality of infrastructure was really very poor. They're often, dispersed island states, very difficult to put in road infrastructure, very difficult to put in health services, very difficult to put in schools or safety spots. So one is the poor quality of the infrastructure. The other is the weak institutional capacity. Where some of the island states in the Caribbean are 20,000 people. The Ministry of Health for a place that's 20,000 people, or the Ministry of Infrastructure, Road and Transport, they're really limited in what they're able to do. There's no say good things, bad things about FEMA. It's just not a comparable situation for communities in the Caribbean that are experiencing typhoons and hurricanes than what we see in America and elsewhere. We already heard about the extraordinary high levels of debt. Many countries are facing huge levels of debt now coming out of COVID, where they spent a lot, but it's particularly large in these small countries that are trying to deal with the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Finance, infrastructure, and have limited tax revenue. Then there's also chronic outmigration. A lot of the skilled population who can help deal with some of the climate shocks has outmigrated. So that's on the challenges side. What about on what can be done? And here, you know, it's music to my ears. I think if you guys come away with one thing from this, or two things that I'm hearing, it's community action, local level action, and it doesn't matter what size. So we do it at scale. At least that's what we try to do at the bank. But it also really matters if you do it with one organization, one community at a time. So what do we aim to do? And I'll talk a little bit more if I get to my last question. I don't know if we'll get there, so I don't know whether I should talk about it now or not. But anyway, what we aim to do is provide resources to communities to strengthen their resilience. And we do this by asking them to come up with a plan. What do they need to do? We're building on what we've heard, local knowledge, local capacity. What road needs to be made climate resistant? What roof always flies off in the moment of a storm? So what is your plan to build your smooth livelihoods, smooth food security? And then present that to the local government, and then we can provide financing for that. Another thing that we tend to do in particularly small island states is work with the diaspora. Cabo Verde has more people living in Boston than Cabo Verdeans in Boston than in Cabo Verde. That diaspora can be an important source of funding, can be an important source of knowledge and support in times of crisis. So how can we, mobilize and work in a more structured way? It already happens informally. Third is tourism. Many small island states live off of tourism, Seychelles, the Caribbean, Cabo Verde as well. And the best type of tourism we can encourage is this big resort tourism, which doesn't have that many backward linkages, doesn't work, is often putting additional burdens on the ecosystem. And look at models like Costa Rica that do ecotourism, small-scale tourism, that are less impactful on the resource base and can be more resilient if supported in times of shocks. And then we heard about planning at the local level I mentioned, but there's also planning at the regional level. There is so much, we're doing regional support for many countries to build resilience for power stations, to build resilience for health. Disease crosses a border, Zika crosses the border. We need to have resilient regional systems as well. And this is particularly relevant for small island states with limited institutional capacity, is to take regional approaches. Resources can come, I mentioned, from the diaspora. In our projects, the bank is doing always now, and more, I shouldn't say always, but more and more setting aside a portion of the loan that could be quickly reconverted into emergency relief if there is a crisis. So making sure that there is a buffer of resources. We also offer what we call catastrophic drawdown facilities, so that countries pay for a certain amount of insurance that if a shock hits, they can draw down on a line. Essentially, it's a line of credit. So let me stop there. So that's just to say, there are challenges, but through planning, community action, and regional collaboration, and building off of diaspora, there are things that we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Over to you, Jevanic, and I would also request you to add your comments about building climate resilient communities.
Yeah, certainly. First of all, let's establish the groundwork with small states that we always say that climate change is an unwanted guest that has just taken over our households. It's a case where we know that our contributions to the emissions are quite low. So that is why when we speak about some mitigating in terms of reducing our emissions, that despite our efforts, it's not really going to shift the needle. It's those that are responsible for the main emissions are the ones we need to deliver on the ambitions. So that is why we left with one of our options, which is adaptation. We have no other choice. We have to try to adapt. And in trying to adapt, like we mentioned, the challenges, the limited fiscal space, but also the vulnerability of our economies, like was mentioned. I come from an economy in the Caribbean whereby tourism is our bread and butter. So within COVID, you can understand that when GDP drops by 20%, the sort of implications that has for life on the island completely. Look at our small nature. So when the hurricanes come through, yes, it may hit one area, but the impact on our little 238 square mile island is literally can be wiped off in no time. So these sort of challenges makes it a bit difficult for us in terms of being able to sort of navigate, because we're trying to adapt, but at the same time, and that is where this year we're going to hear a lot of talk about loss and damage, because despite our adaptation efforts, in spite of all the challenges, we are accessing certain funding and so on to get us to adapt. But there would be these irreversible risk which we have to face, and that is why I always say that for us as small states, that not operationalizing a loss and damage fund for us this year is a major threat to global peace and stability. And that is why, there's increasing efforts to ensure that when these disasters hit, we are better protected. We are able to rebuild our economies at a quicker rate, which will allow us to think. But just one in terms of the opportunities, I know I spoke about mitigation earlier on, but it's a case where how do we get private sector? And I know Louise would have mentioned that diaspora and so on, but private sector has a critical role, particularly if you look at renewable energy. How can we create that enabling environment that the private sector will be more enticed to want to invest in renewable? Because I'm sure there are individuals here who perhaps have projects tied to renewable energy, and there are opportunities within there where we need to sort of bring the private sector on board. Of course, bring the institutional partners like the World Bank and others to see how we can accelerate that. Because if we can accelerate that on the mitigation end, of course, if we can support in delivering on the adaptation funding and then definitely the loss and damage funding, then I think with these sort of three separate approaches, it will sort of set us on a better path where our small states can at least not sink, like we say. Yeah.
Thank you. With that, we would now open the floor for questions from the Preston room. We would be only able to take 3 questions, so please line up in case you would like to ask any questions to our panelists. That's like musical chairs, right? All right, so please state your name, which country you're from, what do you do, and your question. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for everyone for this wonderful conversation we've had today. My name is Hilary Innocent Taylor Seguia from Uganda, and I'm a climate justice activist. I'm also a graduate student of international relations at Harvard University. As an activist of climate change, we are dealing with the East African crude oil pipeline. It's going to be the longest heated crude oil pipeline in the entire world, 1,443 kilometers, stretching from Uganda to Tanzania. So we are dealing with these corporate grid companies like Total Energies, which has 62% of the shares in this project. So those who are affected are the frontline communities. So children are keeping out of school because they're clearing the pathway for the pipeline. Women are facing gender-based violence because government is compensating them with little money. And where we come from, we have polygamous families. So it's very challenging for husbands to divide that money with 4 wives. So in the end, it is women who are suffering. And again, we see also that hundreds of thousands of Ugandans and Tanzanians have become homeless because of this pipeline. So we are making noise all over. We're telling Total Energies, we don't want this planned environmental racism in our country, because we believe that as Uganda, as Tanzania, vulnerable countries, we deserve a livable future. So we've called upon, insurance companies that are, going to provide coverage for this pipeline. We've called upon banks that are financing this project because it needs $3.5 billion to pull out of financing and insuring this East African crude oil pipeline, which is harmful to our lives. So as climate activists, as stakeholders in this whole, I want to pick your mind on how effective we, the vulnerable people of Uganda and Tanzania, can rise up and mobilize ourselves to ensure that Total Energies, CNOOC, that is the China National Offshore Oil Company Corporation, pull out of this pipeline so that we also live a livable future. I thank you.
Thank you for the question. Opira, is this a question that you would like to address? And also would like to open the floor to any other panelists who would like to follow on.
Yes. To my brother there, thank you so much. To me, I think really it's very dangerous to use another dangerous mean, in the pretext of trying to bring a solution to a sexual problem. Because right now our turn we are aware that the climate change in Uganda definitely in different regions. Actually, it used to be different. It used to be eastern region and other regions, and in South Sudan it used to be another region. But right now, all countrywide, almost every part of the country is experiencing climate change. So, to me, in response to my brother, I would say, as much as we expect solutions from a large scale, like international level, we would also think that youth, like I said in the beginning, youth needs to try as much as possible to express their voice using different platforms available. And also evidently trying to bring forward to the funders how dangerous supporting that initiative could lead to. To me, as an advocate for climate change, this is how I started, because I know climate change is interconnected with all aspects of lives. So as refugees, it affected coexistence.
I think there's connectivity. Okay.
And as a video advocate, I decided to use host community. Yes. So I decided to use both refugees and host communities, targeting double solutions on climate solutions, but as well as coexistence solutions. So realizing that it was not only these people living within the community I was advocating for, listening to this. So we used the video, and the video was used in different settlements and actually created a big positive coexistence, besides bringing solutions to the climate challenge. So I would suggest that different social media advocates and different youth who are advocating in different areas of human life, they should be taking responsibility to speak out instead of us waiting for platform, because there are always a daily platform where we can speak to different stakeholders. We also have representatives of our community who are in different parliaments. We can also consult them, and I think they also have the right to take some voice in the parliament, and this can be discussed in the parliament, because I know this is almost a political, a political level stage. I mean, which I think it's at a higher level. So when we use our leaders and they are able to air this out in the parliament, we can be able to push through them, and we can find some level of solution at least. This is what I suggest for my brother.
Thank you, Opira, for sharing this case study. Now I would like to invite both the delegates who would like to question one after the other, and then we can respond to both the questions together. Thank you.
I want to appreciate the panelists for their discussion. My name is Redemptor Mwende. I'm currently a graduate student at American University. One thing I just want to point out is how I've not heard anything about data, yet it's a very crucial and critical aspect in terms of achieving climate change. And I just want to bring out two critical issues about the UN Framework Convention climate change, as well as national determined contributions, reports that are coming in from countries. One thing that stands out in most countries is they do not have domestic monitoring and evaluation systems. They do not have comparable data that shows us what progress they have achieved so far in terms of climate change. The other key critical issue, they do not have anything inclusive of gender, youth, which means these two, gender and youth, are not part and parcel of the process in terms of achieving climate change. So what measures are being taken, first of all, to give technical assistance to country offices to be able to measure, to be able to collect data, to be able to collect this data and aggregate it to global level for us to know what progress are we making and what exactly are we investing on. And then the second thing is what measures have been taken to actually ensure that gender and the youth are part and parcel of climate action. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and the panelists. Thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. I wanted to ask developed countries were able to reach their level of development around unsustainable practices. And developing countries are trying to catch up with the developed world. And they simply cannot let go of unsustainable practices in terms of manufacturing and the construction of their infrastructures. Some economies in Africa rely on oil, for example. So is Africa really ready to implement, climate change policies? And how will that affect their progress when it comes to development? All right, thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we will not be able to take any more questions, but our panelists are always open to answer them one-on-one. There is going to be, I think, more dialogue on gender and climate change in the next 2 days, so we can answer those questions. I would like to request Louise to give quick closing remarks, and I've been strictly warned by the committee to stop this, so that everyone can go for lunch quickly.
So that's a bad sign when I'm the one standing between you and lunch. So let me just try to be really quick. There were some really good questions raised. First, I would like to say, on the first question, that's a particular case and it's already happening. And I thought you got a really interesting answer from Opira. I would also urge all of you to work with your national governments to put ESG regulation in place, environmental and social good governance. Because if we have these regulations in place for stakeholder engagement, for universal access, for labor and occupational health standards, then all of the climate finance, public and private, in theory, would have to adhere to this if they implement the regulation and build the capacity. ESG can really change the trillions that we spend on climate going forward to make it more impactful. The second point I wanted to say is data, data, data. So when that was the question that came up, but show the impacts that you're seeing, document the impacts that you're seeing of the pipeline, put it on social media, take it out to stakeholders as was suggested. A lot is being done in the World Bank and with a lot of bilateral donors on gender and climate action, because it's a real recognition that women and youth clearly need to be part of the discussions around climate action. And there's special funds that have been set aside, special initiatives to make sure in countries that are undergoing particularly just transitions and exiting coal, where communities are going to experience huge socioeconomic dislocation, where make sure women's voices are part of that discussion, even if they may not be the ones in the minds themselves. But saying on the adaptation side, women, we're talking about planned migrations in some cases, movements of homes and villages. Women and youth clearly need to be part of that dialogue. And that's, again, going back to that community focus. And on Africa, it's not, to conclude, climate change cannot be, it's about less energy for African countries. It cannot be stopped. It's not a stop using energy, stop accessing energy. We are very aware in the World Bank that it has to be hand in hand with expanding access to energy and making that energy more green. And so that's where the focus needs to come, but it cannot be a trade-off. But please, I just want to reiterate the key messages that I've heard is the role of climate and communities, that this is being felt at the local level, and that us as international organizations, you as civil society, youth activists, we all need to work at that level, but link also communities to government, because it's building that trust and building those partnerships that are going to help us to be more effective. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to say that let's continue having this conversation. Let's continue to work together. Let's continue to build resilient communities in the face of rising seas and rising tension. Thank you. A big round of applause for the panelists. Thank you.